December 1942. The Pacific Ocean, a vast, endless expanse of dark water. The war had entered its bloodiest phase. Japanese forces dominated the seas, their destroyers slicing through black waves with brutal confidence. But somewhere near the Solomon Islands, a new kind of American weapon was preparing to strike, one the enemy had never truly seen coming. They were small, made of mahogany and steel, barely 80 feet long, crewed by no more than 12 men, yet armed with 4 deadly 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes. Their engines, Packard V-12s, screamed like demons when unleashed, propelling them across the ocean at over 40 knots. They were called PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, America's secret predators of the Pacific. While Japanese cruisers and destroyers ruled by day, these slender ghosts ruled by night, cutting through fog and moonlight, hitting hard, vanishing before radar could even blink. Their mission: hunt Japan's supply convoys, cripple its island defenses, and prove that courage and cunning could outmatch size and steel. But what began as an experiment in naval warfare would soon become legend. From the black waters of Tulagi to the fiery ambushes off Guadalcanal, these boats would shock the Imperial Navy and forge heroes whose names still echo through time. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's the story of how a handful of wooden boats, armed with fire and fearlessness, turned the tide of the Pacific War. February 1942. The world was burning. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. The Philippines were collapsing, and the Imperial Japanese Navy swept across the Pacific like a storm. The United States, still bleeding from the attack, needed something, anything that could strike back fast. The idea came from a bold experiment: small, fast boats that could hit larger ships at night, then disappear before they could be detected. They were the opposite of the mighty battleships America once trusted. They were light, fragile, and often made of wood. But they carried a sting powerful enough to cripple a destroyer. At the Electric Launch Company, YLCO, shipyards in Bayonne, New Jersey, engineers and sailors worked around the clock. They called the project PT boats, patrol torpedo boats. Each vessel measured 80 feet, powered by 3 Packard V-12 gasoline engines that together produced over 4,000 horsepower. They could reach 45 knots, faster than almost anything on water. Their hulls were thin, layered with mahogany. Armor was almost non-existent. A single cannon round could tear them apart. But that didn't matter. The PT boats weren't built to take hits. They were built to strike first. By spring, the Navy's motor torpedo boat squadrons, or RON, as they were called, began training at Melville, Rhode Island. Young men, barely out of high school, learned to handle boats that leapt across waves like wild horses. They practiced firing 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes, manning .50 caliber twin Browning machine guns, and dropping depth charges at full speed. Their training was chaos, and that's exactly what they needed. The ocean was unpredictable. So were these boats. May 1942, Tulagi Harbor, Solomon Islands. The first PT squadrons arrived in the Pacific. The men were nervous, untested, and armed with nothing but speed, instinct, and raw courage. Their orders were clear: patrol the waters, disrupt Japanese convoys, and protect the few remaining Allied footholds in the South Pacific. They faced a nightmare. The Japanese Navy was confident, disciplined, and backed by massive destroyers equipped with radar and superior guns. Against them, the PT boats looked like toys. But that's exactly what made them dangerous. Night after night, these wooden ghosts would creep across the dark Pacific, engines barely humming, their silhouettes almost invisible against the sea. When radar or lookouts spotted a Japanese destroyer, the dreaded Tokyo Express, the PTs would surge forward, release torpedoes, and vanish into the black. One Japanese sailor later wrote in his diary, "We could not believe the Americans used such small boats for war. They came from nowhere, attacked at night, and disappeared before we could fire." Among the earliest heroes was Lieutenant Commander John D. Bulkeley, leader of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. Operating from the battered island of Bataan in early 1942, Bulkeley's PT-41 led daring strikes against Japanese shipping, even rescuing General Douglas MacArthur and his family from Corregidor under enemy fire. For his courage, Bulkeley earned the Medal of Honor, and the legend of the PT boats began to spread across the Pacific. The Japanese started calling them devil boats, tiny vessels that struck like hornets in the night. By mid-year, more PT squadrons had joined the fight. They launched surprise attacks from hidden bases in New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Chain. The seas became their battlefield, narrow straits, shallow reefs, and fog-drenched bays where giant ships dared not go. Every night, flares lit the sky like false dawns. Japanese destroyers, armed with massive 5-inch guns, fired blindly into the dark, hoping to hit something that moved. The PT boats answered with streaks of fire from their Browning guns, tracer rounds dancing across the waves. These were not clean battles. They were chaotic, desperate, fought within shouting distance. Sometimes, Japanese sailors could hear the PT crews yelling as they launched torpedoes. Sometimes, both sides fired until the sea itself seemed to burn. The Japanese, stunned by this new form of warfare, began changing their tactics, keeping convoys under heavy escort, deploying searchlights and aircraft for night patrols. But the damage was done. America's Mosquito fleet had drawn blood. The first major Allied offensive in the Pacific began. As U.S. Marines fought on land, the PT boats guarded the coastlines, ambushing Japanese resupply missions. In one furious week, PT-109, PT-59, and PT-60 all reported confirmed hits on Japanese barges and transport ships. The Japanese Navy, once invincible, now found itself haunted, not by battleships or bombers, but by a handful of small wooden boats prowling the night. The men who served aboard them were not ordinary sailors. They were mechanics, fishermen, college athletes, thrown together by war and bonded by survival. They fought exhaustion, hunger, and the relentless salt spray that corroded everything they owned. Yet when the engines roared and the torpedoes left their tubes, they became legends. As 1942 drew to a close, one thing was clear. The PT boats had proven themselves. Fast, fearless, unpredictable. They were no longer experiments. They were a weapon the Japanese could neither track nor understand. And soon, the world would hear about one PT boat in particular, PT-109, and the young lieutenant who had steered into history. August 1st, 1943, Blackhead Strait, Solomon Islands. The night air was heavy with salt and diesel fumes. The sea lay calm, black as ink. On the deck of PT-109, Lieutenant Junior Grade John Fitzgerald Kennedy, just 26 years old, stood quietly, scanning the horizon. The stars were hidden by clouds, perfect weather for hunting. The mission was simple, at least on paper. Intercept the Tokyo Express, a fleet of Japanese destroyers delivering reinforcements to Columbanger Island. But nothing in this war was simple. These destroyers were monsters, steel beasts nearly 400 feet long, each armed with 5-inch guns and carrying the deadly long lance torpedoes, capable of tearing through any ship on the ocean. Kennedy's boat, PT-109, was a fragile, wooden craft barely 80 feet long, crewed by 12 men and armed with 421-inch torpedo tubes and a handful of machine guns. Against destroyers, it was David versus Goliath. But Kennedy's crew didn't care. They trusted their captain, young, fearless, calm under pressure. Among them were Ensign George Ross, the sharp-eyed navigator, Chief Motor Machinist's mate Patrick McMahon, who could repair an engine blindfolded, and Seaman Andrew Kirksey, quiet but brave, always the first to man the guns. They were brothers bound by fire, waves, and fate. 15 PT boats slipped into the darkness from Rendova Harbor, engines throttled low to stay silent. The water reflected nothing, just black velvet stretching forever. Kennedy's PT-109 was part of Section 2, positioned near the mouth of Blackhead Strait. The plan? Intercept the Japanese destroyers before they could reach Vila Harbor. Radar coverage was spotty. Communication, unreliable. Every minute, the tension deepened. At 1:30 a.m., the first reports came through. Japanese destroyers have been spotted. American PTs launched torpedoes blindly into the dark. White wakes slicing through the water, vanishing without a sound. None hit. The night swallowed them whole. Underscore. Kennedy's crew could hear distant thunder, not from the sky, but from guns echoing miles away. The air smelled faintly of cordite and salt. The men strained their eyes into the blackness. No moon, no light, only the faint hum of the engines. Kennedy whispered to Ensign Ross, "Keep her slow. Let's not give our position away." They idled on one engine, drifting silently. And then a shadow. At first, it looked like a dark cloud sliding across the horizon. But within seconds, it took shape, long, sharp, fast. The Japanese destroyer WWII, 2,000 tons of steel, slicing through the water at 40 knots. The lookout shouted, "Too late." The WWII was already upon them. Kennedy swung the wheel hard to port, engine screaming. But the destroyer was massive, unstoppable. Impact. The sound was like a thunderclap. The WWII's bow tore into PT 109's starboard side, splitting it in two. A wall of fire erupted as aviation fuel ignited. The explosion threw Kennedy backward, slamming him into the cockpit. The sea flashed orange and red, then fell into darkness again. When he surfaced, choking on smoke and seawater, half the boat was gone. The bow section still floated, burning fiercely. The rest had disappeared beneath the waves. "Anyone alive?" Kennedy shouted. Voices answered, faint, scattered. 10 men had survived. 2 were gone. Andrew Kirksey and Harold Marney, lost in the explosion. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the crackle of flames and the hiss of the sea. The survivors clung to debris, their bodies cut and burned. The fire on the water burned brighter, threatening to expose them to any nearby enemy. Kennedy made a decision, the kind that separates leaders from legends. "We swim for it," he said. They spotted a faint shape in the distance, an island. It was Plum Pudding Island, later renamed Kennedy Island, roughly 3.5 miles away. Without hesitation, Kennedy swam to each man, checking wounds. When he found McMahon, badly burned and barely conscious, he wrapped a strap from his life vest around his own teeth and began to tow him. For 5 long hours, Kennedy swam, one hand cutting through the waves, the other dragging his crewmate through the dark Pacific. The rest followed, clinging to floating debris and broken planks from PT 109. Sharks circled. The current was brutal. But by dawn, all 10 survivors had reached the small island, exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. On the beach, they collapsed into silence. Their boat, their home, was gone. They had no food, no fresh water, and no radio. The Japanese controlled the surrounding islands. Rescue seemed impossible. Kennedy refused to give up. He led his men to search for coconuts and rainwater. They found a few, shared them equally, and rationed hope as carefully as supplies. On the second night, Kennedy swam again, alone, through shark-infested waters to scout nearby islands for help. He found none. Still, he didn't stop. It was on the third day that hope arrived in the form of 2 Solomon Island scouts, Bukagasa and Eroni Kamana, working with the Australian Coast Watchers. When they encountered Kennedy, exhausted and thin but determined, he carved a message on a coconut shell. "Nauru Island. Commander. Native knows position. He can pilot. 11 alive. Need small boat." That coconut would later sit on Kennedy's desk in the White House. By August 8, 1943, the survivors of PT 109 were rescued. Every man alive owed it to Kennedy's refusal to quit. He had turned disaster into defiance, and a sinking into survival. But more than that, PT 109 had become a symbol, proof that even when outgunned, outnumbered, and surrounded, courage could turn the tide. The Japanese Navy, once unshakable, now knew the truth. America's small, secret PT boats were not just machines. They were men's hearts on fire, striking from the shadows and vanishing into legend. August 10th, 1943, Rendova Harbor, Solomon Islands. The morning sun rose over a sea littered with debris, smoke, and silence. For the chaos of battle, one story had begun to spread like wildfire. The story of PT 109 and her young commander who refused to die. Among the men of the motor torpedo boat Squadron 2, Kennedy's survival was more than news. It was myth taking shape. In the dim glow of the docks, sailors spoke of how a small wooden boat, a mosquito, as they called it, had stood its ground against the Empire of Japan. What began as a tragedy was now a legend, and legends are dangerous things in wartime. In Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence was furious. Reports had filtered in from the Blackhead Strait engagement. One American PT boat sunk, yet survivors unaccounted for. The Japanese destroyer WWII returned to base with minor hull damage. Her crew puzzled at how such a fragile enemy vessel had come so close, undetected. For years, Japan had mocked America's PT boats as toys of plywood and gasoline. But after 1943, no one laughed. They had begun calling them Kiseki no Kansun, the miracle ships. Because when the sun went down and the water turned to glass, the PT boats came alive, silent, swift, and invisible. By late 1943, American engineers had begun upgrading the fleet. The new PT 167, PT 187, and PT 190 carried radar sets, twin .50 caliber mounts, and reinforced hulls coated in black, non-reflective paint. Their engines, Packard V12s, each pushing 1,500 horsepower, could propel them across the Pacific at nearly 50 knots. They became known as the Devil's Canoes. Their missions were simple but deadly. Intercept Japanese supply barges between Rabaul, Bougainville, and New Britain. Ambush destroyers and troop transports moving under cover of darkness. Insert reconnaissance teams into enemy-held islands. Each mission demanded silence, precision, and nerves of steel. 3 PT boats, PT-59, PT-62, and PT-181, raced through black waters to ambush a Japanese convoy. Radar blips flickered. The boats throttled down, engines whispering. The sea seemed to hold its breath. Range 1,200 yards, whispered the skipper of PT-59. Torpedoes away. For white streaks raced into the night, and moments later, a thunderous explosion tore through the darkness. A Japanese transport, the Tosa Maru, vanished beneath the waves. The ocean lit up like daylight for 5 seconds. Then darkness again. When dawn came, the PT crews were gone, already ghosts. The Japanese Navy scrambled to adapt. They armed barges with 20mm cannons, set searchlights along the coast, and used spotter planes from Rabaul to hunt the PTs. But the Americans countered with ingenuity. They developed smokescreen launchers, camouflaged hulls, and even underwater exhaust systems to mask their wake. These small boats began to play an outsized role in the war, carrying Marines ashore, rescuing downed pilots, and destroying supply lines that fed Japan's forward bases. By 1944, there were more than 400 points boats operating across the Pacific, from the Solomons to New Guinea to the Philippines. One of the most famous units was motor torpedo boat Squadron 33, led by Lieutenant Commander Robert Bulkley, operating off Mindoro, Philippines. They fought night after night against Japanese Daihatsu landing craft and armed barges, often within yards of the shore. The crewmen began painting skulls on their cabins, a warning, a promise. To the Japanese, these fast-moving phantoms became known as Sea Devils. Under a moonless sky, PT-490 and PT-491 crept toward the coast. Their target, a supply convoy bound for Ormoc Bay. Radar picked up movement, 2 barges, 1 escort gunboat. Steady, steady. Fire 1. Fire 2. The torpedoes sliced through the waves, and seconds later, the horizon exploded. Flames roared skyward, painting the night in orange. But victory came at a cost. Shrapnel ripped through PT 491's bow, wounding 3 men. Instead of retreating, they turned their guns on the burning wrecks, shredding survivors, not out of cruelty, but out of grim necessity. There were no prisoners at sea. By the time the Battle of Leyte Gulf began in October 1944, PT boats were everywhere. They spotted the advance of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force and radioed positions to Admiral Halsey's fleet, playing a crucial role in one of the largest naval battles in history. When Japan's massive Yamato steamed through the sea beyond sea, PTs dared to shadow her, knowing one shell could obliterate them. They didn't fire that night. They just followed, reported, lived, because information was as powerful as fire. The legend of the PT boats was no longer confined to one man or one story. It was now a brotherhood. Thousands of sailors, engineers, and mechanics who fought from boats barely larger than the waves they rode. By the war's end, they had sunk or damaged over 500 Japanese vessels, rescued hundreds of downed pilots, patrolled more than 100,000 miles of enemy coastline, and they did it with nothing but wood, courage, and gasoline. In the war rooms of Tokyo, Japanese officers studied captured fragments of PT hulls. They couldn't understand how such small crafts had changed the course of battles. But they missed the truth. It wasn't the boats. It was the men. Men like Kennedy. Men like Bulkeley. Men who could make a weapon out of plywood and faith. When the Pacific winds quieted and the sea grew calm again, the PT boats were pulled ashore, their hulls splintered, their engines silent. But in every scar on their decks, in every bullet hole patched with salt and paint, lived a story of defiance, of invention, of American will. The ghosts of the Pacific still drift in those waters, where would once challenge steel and won. October 20th, 1944, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The night sky glowed faintly from distant fires. Across the dark horizon, hundreds of silhouettes drifted, landing ship tanks, LSTs, destroyer escorts, and PT boats, all converging toward one promise: return. General Douglas MacArthur had just stepped ashore at Red Beach, declaring to the world, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." But for the men of the motor torpedo boat squadrons, the real war had just begun. While MacArthur's armies advanced inland, the Japanese Imperial Navy unleashed its last gamble. Operation Shogo 1, a desperate plan to crush the invasion fleet from 3 directions. It was the largest naval confrontation in human history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And at the very edge of this clash, where giants roared and oceans burned, the smallest ships held the line, America's PT boats. The sea was a graveyard waiting to be filled. 20 PT boats from Squadron 7, 8, and 3 patrolled the mouth of the strait under a moonless sky. Their radar screens flickered with ghosts. At 10:30 p.m., they picked up movement, dozens of blips moving north to south. The Japanese Southern Force, led by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, was approaching, battleships Yamashiro, Fuso, and cruisers bristling with guns. The PTs were ordered to delay, harass, confuse. They knew they couldn't stop them, but they could make them bleed. PT 134 to all boats. Enemy in sight. Range for miles, crackled the radio. Prepare to engage. The ocean erupted. PT boats darted through the dark, firing torpedoes at shadows, weaving between columns of water and steel. The Japanese answered with hellfire. Tracer rounds stitched the sea like lightning. PT 137 took a direct hit. Flames burst across her deck. Her crew leapt into the sea as their boat exploded. PT 152 pressed on, closing within 2,000 yards, far too close, and loosed her torpedoes before vanishing into the blackness. They called it the Battle of the Broken Waters, where speed was the only armor. By dawn, when Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's cruisers and battleships unleashed their crossfire, the Japanese fleet was torn apart. Nishiro and Fuso sunk, Mogami crippled. Oldendorf later said, "The PT boats bought us time. Without them, we'd have never had the kill zone ready." Outgunned but unbroken, the Mosquito fleet had done what no one thought possible. They blinded giants. The Japanese refused to surrender the Philippines. Night after night, convoys slipped south from Manila and Formosa, carrying reinforcements to Ormoc. PT boats waited for them every night. In Ormoc Bay, the war became personal. Crews fought within shouting distance of enemy decks, close enough to see faces in the gun flashes. PT 493, commanded by Lieutenant William Whiteside, destroyed a troop barge with point-blank .50 caliber fire, then rammed another vessel when her torpedoes jammed. The sea burned from stem to stern. But the Japanese struck back. Kamikaze planes screamed down from the clouds, crashing into ships like flaming comets. PT 323 was hit off Leyte, its fuel tanks igniting in a blast so bright it lit the coast for miles. Only 2 men survived. Still, the squadrons returned, every night, every tide. The PT boats now operated from crude forward bases, planks on coral reefs, drums of fuel stacked beside palm trees, machine guns dug into sandbags. Their mechanics worked bare-chested in the heat, rebuilding engines from spare parts, welding holes patched with tin and prayer. They launched raids at dusk, each man knowing one shell could end it all. But fear had no place here. The men joked, smoked, fought, and bled together, bonded by adrenaline and salt. They lived in a world where the line between courage and madness blurred with every tide. As the Allies moved north, PT squadrons hunted the last remnants of the Japanese Navy retreating toward Manila Bay. The enemy's once mighty fleet had shrunk to barges, small transports, and suicide boats, Shinyo craft packed with explosives. The Americans adapted again. PTs now carried 40mm Bofors cannons, rocket launchers, and even radar-guided fire control. They were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters. On January 30th, 1945, PT-77 and PT-79 ambushed a Japanese convoy near Bataan Peninsula, sinking 4 barges and silencing an escort gunboat within minutes. In one night, they erased what was left of Japan's supply artery to Luzon. Everywhere the PT boats went, they left behind a message written in smoke and seawater. The age of the battleship was over. No longer did victory belong to the giants of steel. It belonged to the fast, the fearless, and the invisible. By the spring of 1945, as the Allies prepared for the final assault on Okinawa, the PT squadrons had become living legends, symbols of a new kind of warfare. PT 373, under Lieutenant James B. Carney, approached the shore in darkness, landing Australian commandos behind enemy lines. Hours later, the boat returned under fire, engines roaring as tracer rounds slashed across the water. Carney's crew hauled the commandos back aboard, one by one, as bullets punched holes through the hull. They escaped by inches. When they returned to base, they counted 67 bullet impacts, not one man lost. As the Pacific War reached its final act, the PT boats had become something larger than machines. They were legends made of wood and salt water, piloted by men who refused to yield. Each mission etched their story deeper into history. From Rendova to Leyte, from Borneo to Mindoro, they turned the Pacific into a graveyard for the empire that once ruled it. And when the sea finally fell silent, it was said among sailors, if you saw a wake in the dark and heard the growl of 3 engines, you knew death was coming, and it was painted green. April 1st, 1945, Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands. Dawn broke over the Pacific, soft and golden, but beneath the calm shimmered the bloodiest chapter of the war. This was Operation Iceberg, the assault on Okinawa, and for the men of the motor torpedo boat squadrons, it was the beginning of the end. The once proud Japanese Navy was shattered, its ships rusting on coral reefs or scattered beneath the waves. But the Empire had one weapon left, the will to die. They came in hundreds, diving through clouds like flaming arrows. Each one carried a bomb and a prayer to the Emperor. The skies above Okinawa turned into chaos. Ships burning, men screaming, water boiling with debris and oil. The PT boats were ordered to patrol the coastal shallows, intercepting suicide boats before they could reach the invasion fleet. On April 6, 1945, more than 350 kamikazes attacked the Allied armada. PT boats raced through fire and wreckage, gunning down low-flying planes and intercepting Shinyo suicide boats packed with 250 kilograms of explosives. PT 493, commanded by Lieutenant WW2, spotted one at dawn, a black hull slicing through the surf. Gun it. Open fire. The sea erupted with machine gun tracers. The Shinyo exploded 100 yards away, the shockwave nearly capsizing the PT. All day, the boats fought, dodging, firing, burning, until the horizon was a graveyard of smoke. April 10, 1945, Naha Harbor. As American Marines battled for control of the island, PT squadrons ran supply runs, evacuated wounded, and delivered intelligence teams under fire. Their decks were slick with blood and seawater, their hulls scarred from shrapnel. On one run, PT 490 returned to base with bullet holes in her fuel tanks and an unexploded shell lodged in her bow. The crew simply laughed, patched it with tin, and went out again that night. Because by then, they all knew the truth. The war was ending. But their duty wasn't. June 1945, the Okinawa typhoon. Even nature turned against them. A monstrous storm struck the Ryukyus, with 100-mile-an-hour winds tearing through the fleet. PTs were tossed like driftwood, their moorings ripped apart. PT 373 broke free, slamming against coral, its hull splintering. The crew spent 2 days bailing with helmets, refusing to abandon her. When the skies cleared, the Pacific was littered with wrecks, American and Japanese alike. But the PT boats, the wooden ghosts of the war, still floated. July 1945, Tokyo Bay. The empire was collapsing. Japan's supply lines had vanished. Its navy no longer existed. And in the silence that followed, the PT boats prowled the coasts like silent wolves, hunting stragglers, intercepting barges, rescuing prisoners of war. On July 22nd, PT 363 intercepted a small Japanese patrol craft near the Bonin Islands. After a brief firefight, they captured the survivors. The men looked half-starved, half-insane. One of them whispered, "Where's our fleet?" The PT crew didn't answer. There was no fleet left. Then it happened. August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima. August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki. 2 flashes of light ended an empire. When a radio crackled aboard the PT bases in Leyte and Okinawa, men stood frozen, unsure what to feel. Some cheered. Some just stared at the sea. The war they had fought from the shadows, every ambush, every burning night, was over. Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the airwaves, trembling. "We have decided to endure the unendurable." For the first time in years, the engine stopped. PT crews stood on their decks, listening to the waves that had once carried them into battle. Some wept. Others lit cigarettes in silence. The ghosts of every fallen friend seemed to hover over the water. When peace finally came, most of the PT boats were hauled ashore and burned. Their wooden hulls too fragile for peacetime, their missions complete. At Samar, sailors watched the flames devour the boats that had carried them through hell. One mechanic whispered, "She took us there and brought us back." The ashes rose into the sky, like the souls of the men who never returned. But not all were lost. A handful were preserved, one in Fall River, Massachusetts, another in Battleship Cove, and a few converted into private craft. And one name, carved forever into history, PT 109, and the young lieutenant who commanded her, John F. Kennedy. When he later stood before the nation as president, that same courage echoed in every word he spoke. He had seen death on the sea and refused to surrender. In the archives of the U.S. Navy, there's a quote written by a PT officer from Squadron 9. "We weren't built for glory or medals. We were built for speed and for each other." That's what the PT story was. Men against the impossible. Wood against steel. Fire against empire. When historians speak of the war, they talk of aircraft carriers and atomic bombs. But the truth of the Pacific lies somewhere quieter. In the roar of 3 Packard engines in the dark. In the splash of a torpedo's wake. In the steady voice of a captain saying, "Hold the line." By the time Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, the Pacific was calm. But beneath that calm lay ghosts of men and boats that struck from the shadows and never came home. The PTs had done their duty. They had proven that size never decides the battle, only heart does. They called them mosquito boats. Small, fragile, insignificant. But in the vastness of the Pacific, where empires clashed and oceans burned, these wooden shadows carried the spirit of giants. They struck from the darkness, vanished into the surf, and reminded the world that courage doesn't come from armor. It comes from within. From Rendova to Okinawa, every mission, every wave was written in blood, smoke, and salt. Their battles were not for glory, but for each other, for the man beside them, the flag above them, and the home that waited beyond the horizon. When the war ended, their boats were gone, burned, broken, forgotten. But their legacy endures, whispering across the tides. Heroes are not built from steel, but from resolve. And now, as the oceans grow restless once more, the question returns. If darkness rises again, will we still have the courage to stand, to strike, to protect what must never fall? Because history is not written by those who watched. It's written by those who dared. Remember them. Learn from them. And when your moment comes, fight from the shadows and never surrender.